Hi and welcome. I'm Angela, and today's video live is a little earlier in Australia, 12 o'clock, around 12 o'clock time, as I'm having to go to the doctors today and keeping up with my ongoing recovery adventures. So, I wanted to address what's been coming up with the programs Married at First Sight, which is screening in Australia now, and some of the ramifications of the structure of the program versus the structure of the Love is Blind program, and what that's teaching us about the conversation around love in our culture today. Last video, I think it was last video, I talked about the story of Narcissus, and in the TV series Love is Blind, they're touching on that mythical story of Narcissus where he falls in love with the illusion of something himself. So there's many aspects to illusions when we fall in love. Both shows, Married at First Sight and Love is Blind, explore that, but they perhaps don't really help us to really manage that habit that's so strong in us when we fall in love or when we look for love or when we get into a love relationship and we sabotage it because we have unrealistic expectations and beliefs and stories about love. Stories about love are part of human culture for millennia. And if you look at the work of Helen Fisher, she studies that. She's an anthropologist, and she beautifully says how no matter how many people she studies and how many cultures and how many periods of history, that desire to love is there. So it's a very important theme in our lives throughout all time. In this period of time, in our culture now, we're really looking at love relationships as a potential to understand the self. Keep in mind that was in the stories and the myths of Narcissus and in cultures for centuries, but it wasn't necessarily a cultural experiment. So these reality shows are very interesting opportunities for us to look at your beliefs on love. If you sit around watching the programs with friends or your partner, you can really have great discussions, which I think is more important than the content of the show. And those discussions are going to create your ability to look at your beliefs, perceptions, expectations around love, and also perhaps start thinking about your own marriage, relationship, or lack of, and your yearning for love. So, going back to the myth of Narcissus, he's blind. He's falling in love with his own reflection. And in our culture today, we look at narcissism and we talk about it. But why do we talk about it? Because we still are trying to understand what are the illusions that we have around love. So, any narcissists in your life, they're annoying, but they're important because they're going to really trigger any illusions that you have around love and expectations of how people should be, and also force you, perhaps by a negative experience, to assert the type of love that you would like to claim by first looking at yourself. That's why the myth of Narcissus, staring at himself, is the first step, the first stage to look at yourself. And I wanted to commend, I've only just sped through Love is Blind with my friend yesterday. So thanks to Solo Tantra Yoga for giving me that heads up to the Love is Blind series, because it's just aired this year, 2020, which means it's got a more modern feel to it than Married at First Sight. And I looked up on Google, so it's produced by the same production company. And I believe, or I'm intuiting, that that means they're trying to look at what was the premise of Married at First Sight and how can we make money from another show, but also because as a creator, you're always looking for, well, we did that. What can we do better? What can we do different? What will our audience benefit from or be interested by? And the reviews of Love is Blind has said, it's riveting TV, but it's annoying. And that's good. So in my watching of the series Love is Blind, I fast skip to the end. Don't recommend that because I think you should go through it all. I will watch it more solidly when I've got a few 10 hours to kill. Um, but the reason I went to the end was that it was fascinating to see how people from the Love is Blind experiment, which they called a social experiment, which is very interesting wording, differed to the Married at First Sight series I'm currently watching in Australia, keeping in mind that Married at First Sight is a concept that came from the US, but I'm watching the Australian version. And the Aussie version now I'm watching because there's some really interesting things in that current season. I don't watch every series of Married at First Sight, but I was sort of pulled into it, and I started complaining at the beginning, like, "Oh, I don't want to watch it." Then I got pulled into it, and it's fascinating to watch people untangle on air. And my main request for people watching Married at First Sight is to have some more kindness as you're watching the contestants because they are very vulnerable. And the way that Married at First Sight is set up as an experiment is actually, in my opinion, taking advantage of people's vulnerabilities. However, when I was sped through to the last episode of Love is Blind with my friend's assistants, she explained the show to me and she said, let's look at the end, let's look at the end. The fascinating thing was that at the end of Love is Blind, is that the contestants were, or participants, what's a contest in? I don't know, were able to share what they had learned from watching themselves on the show or watching the show back. And they were reviewing what they had learned. So the show was filmed before 2010 or 20. It aired in 2020, February, I believe. And they watched it. They watched it, the show after they filmed it. They had 10 days to talk to potential mates on the show, love mates, without seeing them behind a screen. So they talked to everyone. It wasn't exactly speed dating because they were talking over extended periods of time, 10 days, without seeing the other person. And then they had to choose who they wished to be married to. And then they weren't forced to be married, they were engaged, and there was a courtship process. Unlike the structure and framework of Married at First Sight, where you just get married and you see the person, which brings us back to the myth of Narcissus, where he's faced with his own reflection and he's lost in that reflection. And you see all the assumptions on Married at First Sight that people make because they see this person and they immediately project their illusions about love and expectations about love on the marriage and on the person. So Love is Blind is different. It's like a slow burn. And it's taking away the visual. And it's very interesting that the show creators did that because this is what the ancients, Aristotle, Plato, others, would debate. And so it's wonderful to see the ancient discussions coming back through these creators of these shows. So I would like to address that in that last episode, what was of Love is Blind, what I saw was a wonderful self-reflection of the participants on what they'd learned from the experiment. And you can see that I'm Married at First Sight, but the difference in the last episode of Love is Blind was this self-awareness of how they had projected their stuff on others, which was unseen in Married at First Sight. I haven't watched all of the Married at First Sight series, but it was a real self-awareness and self accountability about how they had projected their stuff on the other person and how that had resulted in their responses or reaction to the person in the previous episodes, why they had burst, why they had been aggressive or verbally aggressive. And there was a lot of tears and a lot of emotion. And uh, I am contrasting also the American energy to the Australian energy in this video because I think there's important things to understand about how we communicate from the American culture to the Australian culture. And the emotion in that last episode was a deep sense of, I have actually hurt somebody. And in that process, I feel bad, which in the series of Married at First Sight, you don't see that. It gets lost with a lot of flame throwing, and people's emotions flare up because they feel embarrassed publicly. Whereas in the Love is Blind series, it's a little bit more removed because it's more about what's going on in that pod, which is a sense of protection in the 10 days. They're talking to each other. There's a sense of you're cocooned, you're safer, you're not stimulated by the visual element. And then once the couples get together, they are also given a lot more containment and a lot less peer group pressure or expectations of the group to conform as you get in Married at First Sight, where you have every week there's some commitment ceremony, whether they're going to stay or leave in the experiment. It's much more autonomous, self-autonomous and self-directed in Love is Blind. Which brings me to my little peeve point for Married at First Sight with the experts, because once we throw experts into the experiment in the Married at First Sight program, what we see is some really fascinating pushback from the actual participants in the program. And I wanted to give a shout out to um, Ivan from Married at First Sight, because he's my favourite character at the moment because of last night's episode, which aired March 8 in Australia. So Ivan and his wife, I don't know her name, get on the couch in Married at First Sight and are asked about their sexual life. And Ivan quite clearly says, "Oh, I don't need to share that with you and with everybody here." He sort of looks to the other contestants in the room. And then we get some cutaways to the contestants who are rolling eyes or making facial expressions as if that's relevant here, because Ivan's expressing very clearly, "I don't need to share that." And he said, "Well, it's not about that. I'm here to be with my wife and explore that with her." And you start to see the connection between Ivan and his wife about, we have decided we don't need to talk about that in public. And it's very clear that they're on the same page. And then they start to get pushed by the experts. And my, peeve is like, this contestant or participant of this experiment has quite clearly said to you, no, and you're pushing them into some sort of construct socially, like, well, part of the experiment is that you talk about this. And they're like, yeah, but we feel quite clearly not to talk about it. And Ivan's facial expressions are like, he's like a deer in headlights. It's like, I didn't know I had to talk about this. Like, do I have to? I mean, I talk about it with my wife. Do I have to talk about it here? And that's where the Married at First Sight experiment turns into, like, it's not about how can I be controlled when it comes to my intimacy. So remember what I shared in the Narcissus myth. There's something magic about love, where we have complete control in our choices about love. That's why one reason why we pursue romantic love, because every other choice, your career, whether you have children, whether you contribute to society in some role, is pressured by other conditions. Romantic love is a much freer experiment, and you can bring your crazy, you can bring your quirks, you can bring your insecurities to it. And you can choose the partner to celebrate that, or to even challenge that, to maybe let that go, to do something with it, whatever happens, the unknown. We don't know in romantic love. It's very exciting. And here, Ivan is being pressured by these experts to expose something he's not ready to expose. So I wanted to say thank you, Ivan, for saying no. I don't want to speak about that. And I think that's an aspect of Australian culture which is really good in relationships. You could see Ivan and his wife had a sense of camaraderie about what they are together for, how they communicate about things in culture and how they communicate in private, and also a bit of anti-authoritarianism, for want of any other word. In Australia, I think that's really good, energy of Australia, how the government or school or people may tell you what to do and you sort of bow your head and go along, but you're like, no, actually, I'm not going to do that in my private life. So I think that's one thing to champion in Australian culture. However, the response of the experts was disturbing because it was kind of, and also some other people in the room were pressuring them to expose themselves and give up what they think about sexual intimacy. So it's interesting because it's like a peer pressure also in Australian culture to somehow conform to what experts think is good for you and to be exposed about and blunt about sexual intimacy. Whereas for a lot of people, it's always within your nature to be private about things like that. And so I think that's a good thing that happened in Married at First Sight. That he was like, no, we're not going to talk about it. And his wife said, actually, I'll leave the show if I have to talk about it. And she was quite unemotional about it, but very clear. So that's another thing in Australia. You could see in the Married at First Australian um, series that's airing this year, there is a sense of just say it as it is, which I think is wonderful about Australian culture. But the dark side of it is that there's a lot of opinionating, telling people what to do, and speaking up of other participants in the experiment about other couples, when really, is that your business? And I know you're just speaking and saying as it is, but it can also be affronting to people's boundaries and privacy and also their sense of who they are. So consider that if you're going to start opinionating. um, and also the structure of Married at First Sight of forcing people to expose themselves every week can be it's like a, torchlight on the stage. If you want to be on the stage, that's fine. But if you're the kind of personality that does not respond in that, you're going to shrink and you're going to hide. And that's why Married at First Sight brings up a lot of volatility for people because of the forced nature of the experiment. So let me finish then with the aspect of the American culture, which I saw in my speed watching of Love is Blind, and especially that last episode where people reflected back and saw their illusions about love and saw how they flared up and responded in that last episode more emotionally with tears, with thanking the other person that they partnered with and wishing the other person well, which we see at Married at First Sight. But often when somebody says, I wish you the best, it's after they've actually said really awful things about themselves or about the other person. So it doesn't quite land. However, the last episode of Love is Blind, the way it was edited, as well as the participants watching themselves, you could see a different connection to actually understanding what they had done and how that impacted the other person. And this is what I wanted to share about the American energy, which I'm seeing. American culture is a lot more emotive, a lot more gushing with the expression of emotions, positive. And those positive emotions, which can seem a bit mush to Australia or a bit gushy or a bit, oh, you're such a love puddle or you cry so easily, that can actually soften the energy. And you can at one and the same time feel a lot of anger, but feel sadness at the same time, which I think in the American energy can help you realize that if you're going to have emotions of extreme anger and also realize how that impacts another person and have regret or guilt about how you might have impacted them, there's some accountability about how your emotions impact the other person. And that can have a negative side. You can go into guilt. My anger or my sadness has made the other person feel bad. So I feel bad. So that's the negative aspect. If you start feeling guilty about making someone else feel bad, it can come back to you as guilt. So reflection, remember Narcissus, he's looking at the reflection. When we look at ourselves and we use another person to trigger our emotions by saying, oh, you're not doing this for me. How could you treat me this way? Our anger and sadness comes up, our hurt comes up, and we see how we've hurt the other person. That can then reflect back on us, and we feel bad about making the other person feel guilty or wrong. However, you can, as we see in the last episode of Love is Blind, you can reclaim that energy and say, I'm sorry for making you feel that way. And one of the contestants, I forgot which one, he said, no, I wouldn't change that. Don't, there's nothing to feel sorry about because I've got this awareness now. And that's the big difference I saw between the American show and the Australian show this week, that in Love is Blind, after watching themselves and after many months of self-reflection and appreciating how they impacted the other person, how their feelings and emotions and reactivity or choices had impacted the other person, there was a genuine appreciation for that person and a genuine self-awareness of how their actions affect them, their self-sabotage or their need to be heard. And that shift in the last episode was, for me, the most satisfying part of watching Love is Blind, something I don't get from Married at First Sight. And I see it as the nature of the experiment. It also comes back to the intent of the creators. So because both shows are made, or the original script of the show or concept of the show are made by the same production company, it does have a lot to do with the production company wanting us to be addicted to these shows and to keep watching these shows, even if we're repulsed or angered or triggered by the shows. We want to keep watching. So be aware that the creators do have that intent to keep you watching. However, in this social experiment, Love is Blind, the actual self responsibility that the experiment provided, rather than relying on experts, and the nature of the experiment where they didn't see each other and had a lot more choices based on less public scrutiny, based on less visual comparison, based on I get to choose based on my feeling, and therefore I'm more responsible for my choices, enabled the participants in Love is Blind experiment to be more in control of their choices, rather than at Married at First Sight, where you're just lumped by some experts who think you might make a good match. Very interesting difference of the two programs, the intent of the idea of the program, but keeping in mind that they want us to keep watching. So I'm putting it out there for any content producers of marriage or love programs. Please give us programs where we learn how to become self-responsible for our awareness about our emotions. Create structures that I got to see in the Love is Blind series, where we actually see how our illusions of love are not giving us the love we desire, and then how to be in our communication respectful and able to communicate that awareness to either the person that you're lumped with in the program, or to your family members, or to the viewers who are watching you go through the social experiments. So if you have any other ideas to share about the Love is Blind series or Married at First Sight, pop those in the chat. I love hearing other people's views about the program. And please keep the comments respectful of those in the experiment, because they've just served themselves up for us. And yeah, share your opinions and views on those and what you might have gleaned, or the conversations you're having, because that's a social conversation provided by these shows. Thanks for joining the Love Oracle, and I'll be back next week at the 1 o'clock time Australia.